Valentine's Day seemed like any other night. I wanted to take Julia out for dinner, hoping to reconnect after weeks of silence between us. Ever since our daughter Dorothy's death in a tragic accident, Julia had changed. The loss hit her differently than it did me. While I struggled with grief in my own way, Julia seemed detached from reality altogether. Dorothy's passing left an unfillable void in both our lives, but Julia refused to accept that she was gone. She didn't cry when the police called to ask us about the pickup truck that struck Dorothy while she hitchhiked to a rock concert. Instead, Julia insisted on cremation and began carrying the urn everywhere, treating it as if Dorothy were still alive. One day, I caught her strapping the urn into the baby seat of our car, murmuring softly to it. Watching her through the rearview mirror sent shivers down my spine. After that, I stopped accompanying her anywhere. People whispered behind our backs, pointing at her strange behavior. What started as sympathy turned into frustration. I grew exhausted, pretending everything was normal. That Valentine's night, I decided to try again, hoping to bring some semblance of normalcy back. I decorated the dining room with red balloons and heart-shaped candles. When Julia came downstairs, her eyes lit up at the sight. For the first time in months, she seemed to notice me. In a soft voice, I urged her to stay, explaining how Dorothy would have wanted us to celebrate. But Julia surprised me by asking if Dorothy could join us too. Though reluctant, I agreed, thinking progress, even small steps, was better than nothing. At least she sat at the table instead of retreating to her room as usual. Yet, as dinner began, so did her unsettling ritual. Placing the urn next to her plate, she spoke to it tenderly, acting as though Dorothy were present. My patience wore thin when she started serving food to the urn, insisting Dorothy wanted mashed potatoes or steak. Overwhelmed by anger and despair, I snapped. Grabbing the tablecloth, I yanked it violently, sending dishes crashing to the floor. The urn shattered alongside them, scattering Dorothy's ashes among broken porcelain shards. Julia screamed, dropping to her knees in the wreckage. Her actions horrified me. She licked the remnants from the urn, scooped up ash-covered fragments with bloodied hands, and shoved them into her mouth. Her eyes rolled back, and a chilling smile spread across her face as she muttered something about Dorothy being with her forever. Panicked, I tried to pull her away, but she fought wildly, kicking and shouting incoherently. Eventually, I managed to drag her to the bedroom and lock the door until paramedics arrived. 3 years later, Julia remains in a mental institution. Each Valentine's Day, I visit her with red roses, though she no longer acknowledges me. Doctors say she often mimics Dorothy's voice, speaking to herself as if embodying their dual personalities. She has completely withdrawn from reality, leaving me alone with the fragments of what once was our family. If there's someone special in your life this Valentine's Day, cherish them. Life can be cruel to those who love deeply. My name is Emily. I'm 26 years old, and I despise Valentine's Day. For most people, it's a celebration of love and romance. But for me, it's a painful reminder of loneliness and fear. The reason? An experience that still haunts my dreams to this day. It happened during my second year of college. I had recently ended things with a boyfriend and was feeling particularly down about being alone on Valentine's Day. As I walked to class one morning, a friend approached me, holding out her phone. She showed me a new dating app she had joined, excitedly mentioning she already had plans for the holiday. Encouraging me to give it a try, she handed over the phone so I could take a look. The app wasn't mainstream. It seemed like some obscure platform. But curiosity got the better of me. After mulling it over, I decided to download it. What harm could come from chatting with strangers? By the end of the day, I found myself oddly hopeful, imagining the possibility of meeting someone special. As Valentine's Day drew near, I matched with a guy who appeared charming and kind. We exchanged messages for a few days, sharing stories and interests. He mentioned hiking, which resonated with my love for nature, and even sent a funny cat video that made me laugh. Everything seemed perfect. When he suggested meeting up, I agreed without hesitation. He promised to pick me up at 7 p.m. on the big night. On paper, there were no red flags. His photos weren't alarming, just slightly posed, as if he were showcasing his best self. Our conversations flowed effortlessly, leaving me convinced I'd finally met someone worth getting to know. On the evening of our date, I waited anxiously in my dorm room, watching the clock tick closer to 7. Finally, a knock came at the door. When I opened it, he stood there looking every bit the part of a classic bad boy. Dark hair, piercing gray eyes, leather jacket, jeans. Despite his intimidating appearance, I couldn't help but feel drawn to him. Introducing himself as Nicholas, he stepped inside and we exchanged awkward pleasantries. Something about a tattoo on his neck caught my attention, but his vague explanation didn't raise any alarms. We left the dorm together, headed towards his black SUV. Instead of dinner and a movie, he suggested taking a walk through the park, citing the beautiful weather. Agreeing, I followed him into the serene yet eerily deserted space. At first, everything felt fine. We strolled side by side, talking about our lives. He listened intently, making me feel seen and appreciated. But as we veered deeper into the park, the emptiness became unsettling. Not a single soul was in sight. Stopping beneath a large tree, Nicholas grew quiet. His demeanor shifted. He stared at me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. His face slowly turned to an eerie grin as he started to unzip his jacket. That's when I noticed that beneath his jacket was an orange jumpsuit. My mind raced as realization dawned. He wasn't just dangerous. He was either an escaped convict or pretending to be one. Laughing maniacally, he started to move closer to me. Terrified, I ran, adrenaline propelling me forward despite the pain in my legs. Behind me, I heard his chilling countdown. 3, 2, 1. Then came the sound of pursuit. His crazed footsteps echoed as he chased me through the darkened park. Certain I wouldn't escape, I spotted a police vehicle pulling into the lot. Desperate, I screamed for help, collapsing into the arms of the approaching officer as my attacker vanished into the shadows. Though the authorities searched extensively, they never found him. To this day, his threat lingers in my mind. If I catch you, you will never be alone on Valentine's Day again. Since that night, I have lived in constant fear, not just of solitude, but of trusting anyone new. Every February 14th serves as a grim reminder of how close I came to losing everything. I used to love Valentine's Day. It was one of my favorite times of year, especially when I worked at a specific big box store. The store would be decorated with cutesy displays, and we'd stock up on all kinds of romantic-themed items. I enjoyed helping customers pick out something special for their loved ones. I also looked forward to planning a little date night with my boyfriend after work. But things changed, and now I dread February 14th every year because it reminds me of one of the worst moments of my life. That year, I couldn't get the day off. No matter how hard I tried, no one wanted to trade shifts with me. So I ended up working a 10-hour shift on Valentine's Day. It wasn't ideal, but I figured it wasn't the end of the world. My boyfriend and I had already planned to do something nice together later that evening, so I decided to make the best of it. After lunch, I walked past one of the Valentines displays and noticed an older man standing there. He seemed sweet, like he might be picking out something for his wife or someone special in his life. His gray hair and old-fashioned sweater gave him a grandfatherly appearance. Feeling friendly, I approached him and asked who the lucky lady was. He looked startled at first, which made him seem even more adorable. But then he began to explain. He said there was no one special in his life. Instead, he described himself as an old romantic who felt nostalgic around holidays like this. I thought it was charming and asked if he had anyone new in mind. That's when things started to feel off. His responses became jumbled, skipping from one incomplete thought to another. It was clear he wasn't entirely coherent. At first, I assumed I misunderstood him, but as he continued talking, it became obvious that something wasn't right. Despite his ageless energy, he moved quickly and spoke very animated. I realized he wasn't as elderly as he appeared, maybe mid-60s. Something about him didn't sit well with me, and I regretted starting the conversation almost immediately. Politely excusing myself, I began to walk away. But before I could take more than one step, he stopped me, not with words, but by lightly gripping my wrist. The touch sent a chill through me. When I turned back, he leaned close and asked if I'd be his Valentine. The request came across as both childlike and deeply unsettling. Shocked, I laughed nervously, explaining that I was already seeing someone, and I tried to pull away. Instead of letting go, his grip tightened painfully around my wrist. Panic set in as I froze, unsure what to do. In nearly 2 years at this big box store, I'd never dealt with anything remotely like this. His face turned red, veins bulging from his neck as he squeezed harder. Trembling violently, he leaned closer until his face was inches from mine. Then, without warning, he began singing softly under his breath. His voice shook with emotion, each note laced with an intensity that terrified me. After a few lines, I screamed for help, desperate to break free. In that moment, sheer terror gave way to adrenaline. Summoning strength I didn't know I had, I fought to be released fiercely. Just as I managed to push him off, another customer rushed down the aisle and tackled him to the ground. If the man had seemed unstable before, he transformed into a wild animal afterward. He bit the person restraining him, thrashing violently until security arrived. By the time the police showed up, he was practically foaming at the mouth, a horrifying sight I will never forget. The aftermath was overwhelming. The big box store sent me to counseling sessions that did little to help and sent out emails promising better security measures. Statements were taken by the police, and for a while, it seemed I'd have to testify against him in court. Thankfully, he was deemed unfit to stand trial and was sent to a state hospital instead. Though relieved, I struggled to move past the incident. For months, I worked tirelessly on rebuilding my confidence and mental health. Eventually, I convinced myself I'd healed. But trauma has a way of lingering beneath the surface. Months later, while meeting a friend at a retro diner, a song played over the jukebox. It was innocent enough at first, but then the lyrics hit me. They matched the exact tune the man had sung during the attack. Memories flooded back, leaving me paralyzed with fear. Without thinking, I bolted out of the diner, ignoring my friend's calls. Breathing heavily outside, I realized how raw the wound still was. Over time, I learned to confront those feelings head-on. Though the memory will always linger, I refuse to let it define me. I've come to terms with what happened, wearing my scars as badges of resilience. Still, Valentine's Day remains tainted for me, a reminder of pain rather than joy. Every year, without fail, a Valentine's Day card arrives for me. Most people hearing this story might think it sounds sweet or even enviable, but the truth is, I have no idea who sends them, and over time, it's become more unsettling than heartwarming. It started when I was 13 years old. Back then, receiving a card from a secret admirer felt amazing, like a much-needed confidence boost during an awkward phase of my life. At first, I assumed it was just a one-time thing, but as the years went on and the cards kept coming, I began to wonder if someone close to me was behind it. My mom seemed like the obvious suspect. When I was 16, I confronted her about it, but she strongly denied any involvement. She even assured me that if she knew who was sending the cards, she'd tell me. I asked other family members and friends, but no one admitted to being the sender. By the time I got to college, I thought maybe the mysterious tradition had finally ended. That year, I moved dorms because of a burst water pipe in my original room. To my surprise, a Valentine's Day card still showed up, addressed to my new dorm, which was on the opposite side of campus. The only person who knew my new address was my mom. Naturally, I brought it up with her again. But once more, she insisted she hadn't shared my information with anyone. For a while, the whole situation creeped me out. Still, I tried to brush it off. After all, how bad could it be? It wasn't like these were threatening messages. They were just simple cards. People often laughed it off when I mentioned it, saying it sounded like a non-issue. But deep down, the mystery gnawed at me. Fast forward to now. I'm 33 years old. Over the past 6 years, I've moved apartments 3 times. After my mom passed away, I became extremely cautious about sharing my address. No one in my family knows where I live unless I explicitly tell them. One year, I decided to test things. I moved without telling a soul. Not my siblings, not my closest friends. Only my landlord and the utilities company had my new address. For 2 months, I picked up my mail at my old place, keeping my location completely private. Then, February 14th came around. Despite taking every precaution, there it was, another Valentine's Day card waiting for me in my mailbox. No one else should have known where I lived, yet somehow the card found its way to me. The experience has left me deeply unsettled. While nothing overtly harmful has ever come from the cards, the fact that someone seems to know so much about my life and has consistently tracked my whereabouts over decades is chilling. Whoever this person is, they've managed to stay invisible while maintaining their strange annual ritual. And though I've learned to live with it, I can't help but feel a lingering unease each time Valentine's Day rolls around. I'm not one of those girls who uses dating apps, but loneliness has a way of creeping in, especially on days like Valentine's Day. Living alone in a city where no one asks how you're doing can be heartbreaking. A few days ago, feeling particularly isolated, I downloaded Tinder. I wasn't expecting much, maybe some boring conversations or the occasional unsettling message, but then Eric appeared. His profile stood out for its simplicity. Normal photos of him walking outdoors, holding a cup of coffee, and smiling in a way that seemed genuine. His bio mentioned a love for books, good coffee, and long talks. He didn't seem like the type to bombard someone with emojis and awkward compliments. On impulse, I swiped right, and to my surprise, we matched instantly. The conversation flowed effortlessly as we discussed books, movies, and music. Before long, we decided to meet in person. Eric suggested meeting on February 14th. Which felt cheesy, but also refreshing compared to how I usually spent the day ignoring the calendar. That evening, we agreed to meet at a quiet bar downtown. Eric insisted on picking me up, a gesture that initially seemed charming. If only I'd known what was coming, I would have never left my apartment. He arrived right on time, dressed casually in a black jacket and dark jeans. Though he wasn't the typical heartthrob, his smile was disarming, and there was something about his eyes that made me feel uneasy. On the drive to the bar, we talked about trivial things, the traffic, the weather, and the Valentine's Day decorations flooding the city. Eric mentioned he didn't usually use Tinder and claimed I was his first match in months. Something about his tone felt off, but I brushed it aside, assuming it was just small talk. The bar was cozy and nearly empty. We ordered beers and sat at the counter. At first, everything seemed fine. Eric was funny and attentive, though every now and then he would look away as if distracted by something else. He spoke about his work as a graphic designer, his personal projects, and growing up in a small, lonely town. As the evening went on, however, strange details began to surface. Eric had an odd way of answering questions, sometimes contradicting himself or changing his tone abruptly. At one point, he referred to himself in the third person, saying, "Eric's always been a good boy," before laughing as if sharing an inside joke. I tried not to overthink it, chalking it up to nerves or an eccentric personality. But when we left the bar and Eric offered me a ride home, unease settled in. Instead of heading toward my apartment, Eric turned onto an unfamiliar street. When asked about the route, he assured me it was a shortcut and not to worry. The road was deserted and poorly lit, making me increasingly anxious. As we drove further, Eric pulled onto a dead-end road surrounded by trees. My heart raced as I realized something was wrong. I demanded to be taken home, but Eric's demeanor shifted. He looked at me with an unsettling mix of amusement and something darker. When I tried to open the door, it was locked. In the back seat, I noticed a pair of latex gloves and a rope. When Eric slowed down, I unlocked the door and fled into the darkness, my feet barely touching the ground. Behind me, I heard Eric exit the car and begin chasing me. I ran until I found a small abandoned shed and hid inside, trying to steady my breathing. Moments later, Eric approached, his footsteps crunching on the wet ground. He walked around the shed, and I made myself as small as possible, hiding under an old tarp next to some empty buckets of paint. I closed my eyes tight and covered my mouth to quiet my breathing as my heart raced. My hiding spot must have been good enough, because soon I heard the sound of Eric's boots crunching on the ground as he walked away. I stayed hidden for a long time, and once the sun came up, I cautiously stepped out of the shed and made my way to the road and back home. I filed a police report and gave them all the information that I had on Eric, but they said Eric must have been using a false name because they weren't able to match anyone with that name and description. I have vowed never to use dating apps again, knowing I narrowly escaped a fate far worse than loneliness. Thank you for listening to Audible Insomnia. If you've made it this far, please consider subscribing, commenting, or following. I enjoy creating this type of content, and your viewership means the world to me.